All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So my name is John Mann, and I'm an assistant professor here at the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. The title is Potential Rural Impacts of Pension Reductions, and the presentation is going to explore the exposure of rural communities to the risk of public and private pension fund insolvency. So this presentation is based on a study conducted by Dr. Stephen Deller at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Dr. Judith Stallman at the University of Missouri, and Dr. Steve Miller here at Michigan State University. So Dr. Miller is going to be our primary presenter, but Drs. Stallman and Deller are also with us, and they will help answer questions about this study. So as your questions come up, there's a chat box towards the bottom of the screen. So if you'll go ahead and type your questions there. And as a final note, the webinar is being recorded, and a link to it and the PowerPoint slides will be available on the NCRCRD website, so that URL that's posted in the box. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Steve Miller.
Thanks, John. And this is Steve Miller, and with us we have Stephen Deller and Judy Stallman with us as well. So appreciate all their effort and teamwork and collaboration on this project, and the funding from the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development to help fund this project. So let's kind of first off, we'll take a look at the first slide here, and somewhat outline the discussion that we'll be talking about today. So this discussion is really somewhat focused on the multi-employer plans, pension plans, and these are all defined benefits plans where the benefits to the retiree is determined well beforehand and somewhat locked in. So we'll see in a moment why we're focusing on the multi-employer plans. So what we want to look at is fairly unique to the literature at this point. So mostly whenever the academic literature looks at pensions and retirement income in general, they're looking at how it impacts households and household behaviors. So we want to take a look at it from much more macro level view and look at how potential shortfalls of pensions, upcoming shortfalls, and actually some current shortfalls could potentially impact rural communities. And so the structure of the presentation today is we'll look at the motivation behind the study and a little bit of the literature review that we've uncovered. We'll talk a little bit about the approaches, the findings, and we'll kind of synthesize the outcomes. So on that note, let's go ahead and get moving. So when I reviewed the slides, I realized there's a whole lot of slides on motivation. I think there's a whole lot of motivating factors that we want to consider. Part of these, just to get us started out, private and public pension funds are under pressure. We see it in the news on a fairly regular basis, popular media, magazines, and news articles. For the most part, many pension funds at this point are underfunded by the sponsors for various reasons. Part of it, especially when it comes to multi-employer pension funds, is that some contributing funds or unions have stopped contributing to that fund, but yet the liabilities associated with those employees that are registered under those funds are still exist. There's lower than projected returns on investments in those funds and many funds in general. Interesting that generally the rule of thumb is for a pension fund is to count on 7.6% annual returns. Well, since 2000, the S&P has really grown only about 4.1% annually. So the rule of thumb that determines how much has to be invested in the funds to recover to cover the liabilities, the future liabilities, seems to be too low. Pensioners are living longer, creating unexpected claims against the balances well into the future, much further than what was initially anticipated. So we're all living longer to a certain extent. That's good news for pensions and pension funds. It's not necessarily good news. And also, there seems to be somewhat of a history of exuberant optimism on behalf of both sponsors of the pensions and the beneficiaries that contribute to those pensions. So whenever a job is offered, certain benefits are associated with that job. Oftentimes, one could perceive that the employee is taking it for granted that that pension is going to be there. The sponsors, similar to having lower than projected returns on investments, are over optimistic about the returns that's going to be paid to those pension funds. As an interesting example, just recently the California Public Employees Retirement System, which is a public pension, which we're not covering here, but that pension fund decided to correct the over projection on the returns, where the rule of thumb was 7.6, and that's what they had it set at. They decided to bring it down a little bit, but they only brought it down to 7%. So with the stock market over the last, let's see, 17 years, returning 4.1%, it's evident that the nature of these pensions being underfunded is going to persist in the future. So private pension funds fall into two categories. So this is excluding like CalPERS in California, but this is private funds, single employer pension funds, Ford, IBM, any individual organization can set up a pension fund for their employees as part of the package of benefits that employees receive. So in those cases, there's a single party responsible for managing the fund. Alternatively, multi-employer pension funds can be a little bit more convoluted. We have multiple employers and or unions that are jointly responsible for managing the fund. That is, if one of those sponsors decides to bail out of the fund, the ones that are remaining are still held liable for the performance of that fund. So there's somewhat of a free rider problem associated with this, with these funds. There's also somewhat of an adverse incentives for new firms to join existing multi-employer funds. So whenever a fund is actually underperforming, underfunded, it makes it very difficult for them to recruit new firms to contribute to that fund and enter in with that multi-employer fund. No one wants to join on to an existing liability that they didn't incur. So these adverse incentives make multi-employer funds, pension funds, even more treacherous as we move into the future. Remember, they have a committed obligation to a certain payout at the end of the at retirement, and those are basically established beforehand. So the number of pensions, or a number of workers with pensions, has steadily declined over time, though, by all means. Many employers have froze their plans, and at this time, most are expected to freeze their plans in the foreseeable future and go with more of a defined contribution set of plans, like 401k plans. So that's also putting continued stress on these systems as individuals retire, especially if they're underfunded. They require, or these pension funds really require, additional funds to be added to those pensions to keep them afloat. If employers are bailing out of these funds, of course that revenue is not coming in to help shore up the shortcomings. Okay. So more on motivation. So looking at, okay, so where does a typical household receive income? And this, what we're showing here is from the Office of Retirement and Disability Policy. It's the income of population 55 or older. So if there's one individual in the household age 55 or older, this is representative of the income breakout. So we can see earnings, and earnings is kind of fascinating because these are individuals that continue to be in the workforce. And we see that this earnings category seems to be the only one, or the one in the greatest growth. So we've seen this trend over time, and there's a bit of discussion about threats to pension funds causing workers to stay in the workforce longer. and that has real implications down the road. Social Security right now makes up the bulk of older household income, 33%. Asset income could be rental properties, could be stocks not held in pensions, any type of additional property type income. And then pensions make up 21%. Now, this pensions also includes 401ks in this particular statistic here. And then, of course, there's other public assistance as well. So, in 1974, the government established that there's a threat to pension security. So they created what's called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. And so at this point, or the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation pretty much acts like the it's an insurer of these pensions. It acts like the I'm losing it today. It's nonetheless. Yes, the FDIC. That's what I was looking for. I can't believe I couldn't remember that. But it acts like the FDIC, where the FDIC insures bank deposits. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation guarantees the future payments of pensions. Usually, though, it's at a lower rate than what the actual pension promised to the pensioner. Under this, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, there's two different categories and two different programs. The single employer program, there's about 30 million workers under that program under 22,000 plans. And it's stable at this point and is expected to generate surplus revenues over liabilities. That means as an insurance company, it's taking in more fees and revenues than it's actually expected to dole out. The multi-employer program, on the other hand, has 10 million workers and 1,400 plans overall. It's unstable and is likely to use up all of its assets by the end of 2025. And to kind of give you an illustration of what this looks like. So the light shaded bars are the single employer program, and this is up through 2016. The dark shaded bars is the multi-employer plans. And we can see definitely that since 2013, the multi-employer program liabilities have more than doubled relative to its assets. But alternatively, the single employer plan seems to be improving recently. So the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation is also the largest federal corporation. It covers 40 million workers' pensions overall. So through a recent analysis, the Government Accountability Office has looked at, and the Pension Guarantee Corporation has looked at all these different plans, and it has determined basically that about the funding ratio of these plans is about 47% overall. And let that sink in a bit. It basically means for every $1 of expected pension payout, there's only 47 cents available to actually fulfill that obligation. So we certainly see a dire situation coming up. The Public Pension Benefit Corporation, Guarantee Corporation, multi-employer fund currently has $2 billion in assets, but only $54 billion in liabilities, expected liabilities. It's quite disequal. So somewhat to defray the inevitable, many multi-employer pension funds seek to modify the benefits component of their defined benefits agreement. This recent act, the Klein-Miller Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act of 2014, allows these individual multi-employer pension funds, and it's only the multi-employer funds, to petition to modify those benefits in the future. And we've seen a lot of news stories and a lot of upheaval about this, the threat of individuals that are currently retired or nearing retirement age being posed the catastrophic event of actually having their planned retirement income decreased. So that's one way of approaching this and keeping these pension funds viable. Alternatively, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation has also increased premiums on a graduated scale. That is, the rate is a little bit more risk-based. In the past, it was a fixed rate per number of beneficiaries under the pension, but now they've changed it so that if you're way underfunded, you're going to be charged more. And of course, that only makes the pension fund increases their cost. It doesn't really help out in the long run. But it does hopefully provide some support for the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation overall. Okay. So, not only is the pensioner impacted by pension insolvency, but also the community, and that's what we want to look at. So, the income to the pensioner is also the income earned by a community. Recognizing this, the degree of community exposure may vary across community types. We want to take a look at that. And income spent in the community generates a secondary set of transactions we, as economists, tend to call a multiplier effect. So we want to measure this within a given region. So given this, we wanted to better inform the potential economic impact of sudden change in pension payments to rural communities, and kind of focusing on the rural community part of it, and focusing on what characteristics within the community that may help us identify what communities are most prone to impacts and what otherwise. So we kind of set up a hypothetical, which we'll talk about here in a bit. So here's the approach. So we use a case approach using a Central States, Southeast and Southwest areas pension plan, otherwise called Central States. This is by far one of the largest pensions out there. It is the largest, 4 times larger than the next largest multi-employer pension plan. So 411,000 members. Fund currently pays out about $2 billion more in annual liabilities than it receives. Several contributing sponsors have also exited. The UPS paid $6.1 billion to exit this, but even though it's no longer part of the Central States plan, they're still liable for up to $3.8 billion if the plan goes bankrupt, because it's kind of like a very messy divorce with children. You really can't escape those future liabilities once you become a member. It's expected to run out of money within 10 to 15 years. There's also a Kroger just recently in 2017 announced that it's going to exit the Central States plan as well. So it's facing some significant headwinds. But this isn't the only pension plan that's in trouble. The situation is mirrored across the U.S., notably the United Mine Workers of America, mostly in the Appalachia area, has 115,000 members, and it's funded a little bit better, 72.3% overall. So kind of get a feel for the breakout. This is by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, tracking distribution of defined benefit plans across the U.S. And we see here in the Great Lakes region, the Great North Central Great Lakes area, we have a really high exposure overall to pensions, pension plans in general. So pension income makes up a larger share of this group right here. You can also, otherwise, the rural areas, let's see, my mouse, there we go. Rural areas around the Rocky Mountains, southern midsection, Oklahoma, Texas, tend to have a lower exposure overall. And then there's the southeast. But otherwise, we have quite a bit of exposure on the two coasts, down here in the middle part of the U.S. and the north central parts of the U.S. So let's get rid of the arrow. There we go. So rural areas overall tend to be more exposed to changes in pension income because of the aging in rural America. So we've known this for about 10 years, probably even longer, that the rural America is aging faster than urban America. The distribution of retirees is really dependent on pensions, is not well understood at this time, and hopefully with this we can help shed some light. So we use the IRS Statistics of Income, SOI data, 4-year averages to map out county-level pensions and annuity income. Now this is one of the challenges of this project, is that there's not really a single data source that tells us exactly how much income is generated from pensions versus other retirement plans. All of it comes basically from the 1099-R forms, which you fill out if you have a 401k or if you have a pension or any other kind of annuity, a retirement annuity. But it gets us pretty close. We use the never can pronounce this because it really makes no sense to me. Pronunciation. Geddes Ord GI star statistics to identify clusters above and below average dependency. This is kind of a spatial clustering, kind of identifies where like clusters exist spatially, and we'll see an example of that here in a second. So let's take a look real quick at the distribution of defined benefit plans overall using the IRS data. Now this is the share of returns that's declaring some kind of pension income, share of returns with the 1099-R form attached. And we see that there's a kind of this grouping up in the north central, or Midwest, I guess we call it. A little bit along the coast area here, down through here. But it tends to be pretty light around the mountain area in Oklahoma and Texas. But using the grouping statistic, it kind of groups things out this way. So we see these hot spots is what we actually capture with this. And right here in the Great Lakes regions, a hot spot where we have a greater dependence on, or a greater share of tax returns with 1099-R forms. Also along the California around here, but once again, mountainous areas, Midwest, or the middle part of the U.S., not as much exposure overall. We can go a little bit further and look at the share of AIG or AGI income. It's a adjusted gross income on the tax forms. So the share of the adjusted gross income made up of the value of the 1099-R form. And so this is a little bit more of the dependence on the income side, not on the number of forms being submitted. So it's fairly similar overall. We see kind of same area up here in the Great Lakes region. A little bit greater exposure on a income basis along the West Coast here in New Mexico. Using the same clustering approach, paints a similar picture, but you see that even this, though this is in the Great Lakes region, right around Chicago, tends to be cold because the share of income is not really as high as the number of forms that are turned in with a 1099-R. So, but the distribution that this is showing right now, as much as anything, is really kind of showing that this is not really something that someone can say, well, that happens over there, it's not in my territory. This is a nationwide issue, and so by looking at this, we can definitely see that it needs to be addressed at the nation. And so just kind of looking, comparing what we saw there to the what's called the USDA field codes, which identifies what's a metro, what's a non-metro, what's a remote county. We see that there's somewhat of a correlation here. We see the remote counties here in the middle part of the U.S., northern part of the Great Lakes, where we saw great exposure to pensions overall. So what we want to do is we did this along many different dimensions. Well, we compared the characteristics behind the county to their exposure to pension risks overall. So we looked at the urban-rural divide, economic base, county type. We go into greater detail in the actual paper than what we'll cover here. But some of the highlights that come out of this is basically that metro areas have a higher average pension payment in overall. So, but that also corresponds with a higher density of population. But non-metro or non-metro counties that are adjacent to metro counties tend to have a high share of dependency on pension incomes. Part of this, I think, has to do with where individuals choose to live. Those with pension incomes we find in the paper have higher levels of income overall, making them more mobile relative to retirees that don't have access to pensions. From an economic base perspective, those counties that are non-specialized, farm counties, mining, manufacturing, and government counties, recreation counties, tend to be much more exposed. Recreation counties reflect on what we just talked about a second ago. It's a destination for early retirees. And because of that, we see a clustering of pensions in those counties. Retirement destinations, those counties with low education, persistent poverties, they tend to be more exposed overall to potential impacts from a reduction in pensions. So, okay, so we created these tables across different county types, and what we have here is we're looking at metro counties right here, adjacent non-metro counties, those rural counties adjacent to the metro, and then remote counties. And the in column here tells us how many counties fall in these categories. So, so looking at this, the metro counties, there's tends to be a higher overall per capita pension income. So 2,000 per capita versus for remote non-metro 1,600. The share of the aggregate adjusted gross income as that's made up of pension income, it tends to be a little bit lower in metro, much higher in adjacent non-metro areas, and about the same with remote non-metro and metro counties. And share of filings with pensions, it's kind of reflects the same. We have a higher share of filings with pensions in adjacent non-metro. Metro counties a little bit lower, and non-metro is even lower than that. So just kind of give you a feel for the breakout now. We found that the differences across these different categories, county types, is significant overall, as we can see down here with the probability statistics. Okay. So now this one is like before, we're comparing against different county types, and these are economic base. So non-specialized and metro counties is categorized here. Farm counties, those counties that specialize in farming, mining counties, manufacturing counties, counties tied to state and local government, and recreation counties. Now here the recreation counties stand out. So per capita income or pension income per capita is 2,700 compared to low for the farm counties, which farms obviously generally don't participate in defined benefits programs, tend to be the lowest. Share of the AGI income, it's once again its highest for recreation counties. Once again, kind of lending itself to the fact that individuals self-migrate to these areas, the more affluent ones. And the share of filings with pensions reflect kind of a similar note all the way across. And here's the average pension per pension return. It's much higher in these recreation counties versus farm counties and the other counties. So the paper spells out others as well, interesting contrast. But to kind of summarize what we find here is that economies most exposed to risks tend to be metro counties in terms of pension income per capita. That is, in terms of total value, metro counties are very highly exposed in absolute terms. Adjacent non-metro counties in terms of income shares, the share of filings and pension and growth independence. We trace the growth over 4 years, and so adjacent non-metro counties tend to be a place of migration where those with pensions seem to be locating at. Remote counties specializing in recreation and government sectors in terms of income and shares and shares of filing. So remote counties tend to have a higher share that have pensions, and also the income in that group is actually much more made up of AGI, or I'm sorry, pension income. And then there's remote counties specializing in migration and manufacturing. So economies most exposed to pension shortfall risks. How does that differ from what I just talked about? It's still more of the same. Retirement destinations, as we've talked about, they may reflect higher mobility overall, so you have a greater self-selection into those regions. Counties with higher education tend to have a greater risk. We're not really for sure why, but it also kind of consists on the counter side, counties with persistently high unemployment. But counties with stable population, that is, population is not growing or declining, seems to be a little bit more exposed overall. So maybe it's a symptom of just an immobile workforce. So, okay, so we wanted to take within the Central States region, take a sampling of several different counties, representative counties, and kind of take a look at how a reduction in access to their pension funding would impact their economies as a whole. So we looked at the statistics of income and determined how much income is coming from pensions, and then hypothetically said, what happens if 50% of that disappeared? So nine counties, non-metro counties, were selected within 2 dimensions based on the remoteness, whether they're adjacent or non-adjacent to a metro area, population size, anything. A county with less than 35,000 we considered to be a small county. A medium county, any county above that, that's rural county. And so we look at the shares of tax returns with pensions. And annuities are the ratio of pension incomes to annuities range from 16 to 40%. Or I'm sorry, tax returns with pensions and without. Pension. The value of pensions divided by annuities on average range between 6% and 23% of adjusted gross income. And we'll show a table here in a bit. So once again, we assumed a 50% reduction in pensions and annuities because we can't separate those out. We used the M-Plan Pro for each of the respective counties, and we just assumed the reduction in pensions is reflected in a change in household income in the $35,000 to $50,000 range, annual income. We estimate the induced effects and direct effects are added back into the final estimates to get a overall assessment of how much the income would change overall. Get rid of my arrow. So here's the counties that we looked at. It's Newaygo County, Roscommon County in Michigan. We looked at Meeker County in Minnesota, Winona County also in Minnesota. In Missouri, we looked at Adair County and Johnson. In Wisconsin, we have 3 counties, Clark County, Marinette County, and Grant County. They all kind of represent different sizes. Like Newaygo represents a medium-sized county. It's just north of Grand Rapids, so it's adjacent. While Roscommon County is out in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty much it's small overall population number. And the same with in Missouri, we looked at Adair County, which we consider small by population size. It's remote. While Johnson County is medium size and it's adjacent to a metropolitan area. So we try to break these out throughout the states. So number of percentage total returns range substantially. We have 16% for Clark County, which we consider to be a small but adjacent county to a metro area. And a high of 40% in Roscommon County in Michigan. Pensions as a percent of adjusted gross income, once again, our lowest value here is 6%, and highest value is at 23% for Roscommon County. And it just seems like Wisconsin overall comes in pretty low as far as the shares go, but Michigan comes in really high overall. And so here's the annual payments in thousands for the counties for the 1099-R forms. And so we run these through MPlan, and these are our estimated impacts overall. So the first column there is a change in pension income. That's our direct effect, so that's how household incomes in the 35 to 50K range decreased overall by 43 million in the Newaygo County case. And then from that, the MPlan provides us the secondary transactions and the labor income associated with that, as well as the change in employment and the change in income. So we come up with the corresponding numbers here. Now this table itself in absolute numbers isn't really too beneficial, because what exactly is a loss of 192 jobs in Newaygo County? So how big is it, or how large is it relative to the change? So when I can consider these in terms of ratios, let's say how many jobs lost per million dollars in pension income loss, we get a ratio of around 4.4% for Newaygo County. And it can be as high as for Marinette County, 6.3 is that ratio. As far as total income, and what we mean by total income here is basically contributions to gross domestic product or gross regional product. So our GDP measure. And so which represents all the income to individuals, proprietors, as well as tax revenues earned by the government. And so those ratios come out to hover around 1.3. So for every $1 reduction in pension payments to the local community, we're looking at our county, we're looking at about $1.3 or $1.30 loss in total income. Labor income is about $1.10 per dollar lost. So overall, the threat of pensions shortfalls to pensioners is largely well documented. What's not well known is how it's going to impact local communities, and this is somewhat of a first swipe to take a look at that. Regional exposure to pension risk are not uniformly distributed, as we've seen here, If we compare those tables a little bit further, we find some substantial variation over each of them. Metro counties tend to be more exposed, followed by non-metro counties. Retirement destinations tend to attract higher income pensioners, increasing exposure overall. Let's see. And so we use 9 counties in the Midwest to model the economy-wide effects, and like we just talked about, the impact multipliers tend to be largest for larger economies. That's kind of expected. Larger economies tend to transact with themselves internally much more. Smaller economies tend to purchase outside their economies, generating leakages. Now, one thing that we did find that we didn't highlight here is that Adair stands out for some reason. Adair County, Michigan, Missouri. It has the largest change impact multiplier per $1 million in change in pension income. It came out with 6.83 jobs per million versus the total overall average of 5.2. And it's both remote and it's small. So it kind of lends the question as to whether or not remote counties tend, because they have less leakage from their economy, we spend more so locally than exporting those dollars out for imports, whether that's going to be a substantial contributor to the overall impacts. So, and the gross regional product, total income multipliers tend to center about 1.35. So those are pretty interesting baselines that we can kind of use to kind of gauge policy discussions overall. And that summarizes what we have. So I think we're open for questions. I think we have several questions or a conversation going.
Yes, Steve, thanks for that presentation. So as your questions, we do have a dialogue that's started. It looks like both Steve Deller and Judy have responded to some of these. So I've got one question, but I wanted to give Judy, you and Steve Deller an opportunity to kind of add your 2 cents to the presentation by Steve. Do you have a couple of points you want to highlight or something you want to add to the presentation?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that Steve mentioned that I think is lost, is that almost all of the attention that's been put into studying this whole issue has been looking at individual households, individual pensioners, and how that's going to play out into the larger community is we haven't found anybody that's been looking at that. So this is kind of something that I think a lot of communities need to be aware of, particularly those communities that have promoted retirement migration as an economic development strategy. A lot of high amenity areas have kind of gone that way, and unfortunately they may have set themselves up for an exposure here that we hadn't thought of. So there are some communities that really need to kind of be aware of this. The other thing, if you go back and look at those maps, you can kind of see kind of the Rust Belt, the old manufacturing belt, and a lot of these pensions are tied to the old manufacturers, and a lot of those old manufacturers are now gone, or they've greatly scaled back, and that's where a lot of the risk is really at. Particularly in Michigan, where you have the auto industry's gone through significant restructuring, and some of those pension plans were extremely generous, and it's really not clear whether or not they'll be sustainable. The other thing is that we kind of skimmed over a little bit is some of the state pension, the public pension funds are really, really at risk. You look at some states like Illinois and Kentucky, and they have pension obligations for public employees that they can't meet. They simply cannot meet. And it's going to be a house of cards that could come crashing down.
Judy, do you have anything you want to add to this?
I'll just address, I think Steve covered some of the other things. I'll just address Adair, Missouri, as yes, a very small, very remote county, and that high sort of jobs lost per $1 million. In such a county, you get into what our friend Lonnie Jones used to call the mailbox economy, where it's the Social Security checks and pension checks coming in that are keeping a lot of businesses open. And so the businesses in these counties may be much more reliant on the pension income than in other counties, simply due to lack of diversification of the income in the county. And so that may explain something of that higher job loss per $1 million loss.
Well, I really liked this this hotspot map, but I was curious. So when you kind of zoomed in a little bit, you focused on the Great Lake regions or the Great Lake states, and I'm curious because the other that Steve Diller mentioned was the amenity or the retirement kind of destination states economies based on it. Do you have an indication on which state or a couple of states or which communities might, I hate to use this term, but kind of where the dominoes start to fall first? Like what states should we be looking out for to really, let's see this process start getting really.
This is Wisconsin, Steve. I think if you take out the kind of the old manufacturing belt, if you look down at like New Mexico, where you've had a lot of retirement migration moving into the area, outside of that retirement migration, I think that's where Lonnie Jones's kind of mailbox economy comes into play. As you get into places like New Mexico, it could be really devastating for a lot of those types of communities because there isn't a whole lot of economic activity within that state, and you start looking at pensions, and it's a major source of income. You could also get into parts of Florida, parts of Florida there, but I think the Florida economy is more diversified, that they're able to absorb it a little bit more than someplace like in New Mexico.
There's also, just looking at the data, there's a sense that there's a degree of rigidity, that individuals that work in a community end up retiring and staying in those communities. So those are communities, as Steve was pointing out, the auto sector, very generous benefits. Can those benefits be sustained in the future? A lot of those individuals end up not actually moving out of the community when they retire. But those that are moving, they tend to be those with pensions.
That's a very good point.
Steve Miller, could you kind of go back to that one map that you had with, or that one figure you had with the breakdown based on the different industries and how the industries were going to be impacted? I basically looked at that. Yeah, so I was trying to think about that in terms of the hotspot map too, and so it was so we kind of got the recreational part figured out. I'm curious about the federal and the state government, and so if you could go back to the hotspot map and maybe talk just briefly about maybe some of those areas that might be impacted by that. This hotspot map is really fascinating to me.
Right. Unfortunately, we really can't break out what is private pensions versus public pensions in the IRS data set, if I'm correct. And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong. But so in which case, what we're capturing there is also the exposure to public pensions. And public pensions could be in worse shape overall, as Steve had alluded to. And he mentioned about states, but we also see here in Michigan a lot of rural communities and a real conundrum on trying to figure out how to raise tax revenues to pay for past obligations to pensions. So it's I'm not for sure if we can look at this map and compare it to what we saw on that table and glean something, but we do definitely have this little bit of activity here around Washington, D.C., don't we?
The other thing to remember when we're when we're talking about rural counties, the ones that are dependent, and that previous chart that Steve showed, it's looking at dependency on that type of industry. And the rural counties that are dependent on government, state and local government and federal government employment, often, not always, but often are counties where there is really nothing else. Yeah. And so therefore the local school system is the major employer. The county itself is a major employer. When you get to the federal level, you can get around Army bases and things like that. But in many of the rural areas, the dependence on government employment is because there is very little else there.
I bet you we would find a positive correlation with farming communities and those government-centered communities.
So one last question before we wrap up the webinar. So the dialogue in the chat box has been kind of directed about, kind of from a broad perspective, getting people to think about what sorts of action to take. What might be maybe the best takeaway? So if you're trying to either inform the local government politicians or extension professionals, what's I think the big takeaway from this in terms of preparing your communities?
That's a good question. I think we're really early in overall in looking at this. There's, as far as data goes at this point, there's a challenge in actually separating out what is exposed pension income versus what's not exposed to the pension shortfalls. It's definitely a national issue. What we see is it's across the board. It's not just isolated in the Great Lakes region. It's not isolated here or there, but rather it needs to be addressed at a much broader perspective. And though policies are evolving, we just saw in 2017 the Democrats introduce a bill that offers loans to these struggling multi-employer pension funds. But the loans also have stipulations on what that can be spent on, that is what they can invest in and what they can't invest in. Overall, it looks, some pensions are calling it fairly promising if this actually gets passed, but at the same time, when you really look at the actuarial numbers, it's still not going to be enough.
I would like to say, going back to Bridget's question about what it means if elderly populations move out and take pension retirement income with them. Steve and I were part of a group of people who did several studies on the impacts of retirees on rural areas. And if they're coming in and bringing in income, or if there's living there but they're now bringing in pensions or income after they retire, that showed a positive impact. Well, because these are basically in-plan studies, you can look at those and sort of reverse it. If they created this many jobs, and if you take that same amount of income away, then you are likely to lose a similar number of jobs. Mm-hmm. So you can look at those previous studies as some sort of guideline.
Exactly. I mean, you could almost think of the retirees moving into the area, even if it's not, if it's just moving out of the urban city into a smaller neighboring community. We used to view it as kind of the traditional export base. These retirees are much like an export base or basic industry, but rather than producing a good or service and shipping it out, what they're doing is they're bringing their pension income in. As far as the local economy is concerned, it's the exact same thing. But what we're coming to realize now is that a lot of that pension income or that retirement income, it's at risk. It's at risk because so many of these retirement income streams have been severely underfunded. So it'd be just like any export-based industry that's in your community that is now suddenly at risk. Exact same logic applies.
Okay, well, we are at 3 o'clock, so I want to say thank you to our presenters, Steve Miller, Judith Stallman, and Steve Deller. And a reminder to you in the audience, this webinar will be posted on the NCRCRD website. So the URL is listed below with a copy of the slides. And I want to say thanks both to our audience and to our presenters. And with that, we will conclude this webinar.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.